Hey everyone, can you hear me? Okay, cool. Looks like we're good to go. Give me just a minute. Be right back. So, if we're good, I'm gonna get going started. So basically today we're gonna cover the basics of React, TypeScript, and CSS. Thank you guys for coming out. Really appreciate it. I know it's been tough with the quarantine and everything else that's going on. So I appreciate you guys taking the time to come out today and come for the workshop. So, yeah. If you guys are going to be following along, please type in the chat that you'll be following along. I just want to see who's going to be watching and who's going to be actively following. Hey, Sandeep. Right, so I'm going to be showing my code console the entire time. It's going to be on the left side of my window, as you can see. And I'm going to just go ahead and get started and jump in. So I'm just going to cd into a directory that I want to start my project in. I just have one already picked out, and I'm going to use this command. So you guys need to have React installed through Node.js and npm, and I'm going to post a link in the chat right now. But this is a set of libraries for both JavaScript and also used for Node.js, JavaScript, React, basically runtime that we can use to do web development. It's really useful because basically JavaScript nowadays runs on npm of some kind. And so in Node.js as a backend, so if you want to do full stack and completely Java, in JavaScript, this is a fantastic way of doing it. So I'm going to assume you have that installed. And I'm going to do something, it's going to be, tell me if the text is too small on my console. I just zoomed in, maybe that'll help. Also, how's my quality on my, okay, cool. I did make it cool. Is that big enough? Cool, yeah. So gonna do something called create React app, and this is basically just a really easy way to get started with React, right? So it's a template. It handles a bunch of the build for you, all the compilation behind the scenes stuff, which you really don't have to deal with as someone who's new or even mid-experienced. Like for example, I still use that nowadays for my client professional contracts. So basically, it's good for most use cases, and I haven't really had a need to eject out of create React app just yet. I'm going to do something called dash dash TypeScript, right? And Right, dash dash template TypeScript, and what this will do is basically set up React, create React app with a TypeScript template. And the reason we use TypeScript is just because it helps with static typing, at least compile time. And what that means is essentially JavaScript is a dynamically typed language. Java, right? If you've done Java, C++, you have to say int, you have to say string, float, double, things like that. Basically define the type that you're using. But in JavaScript, you don't. And the issue with that is you get a lot of really weird bugs as you're using libraries and templates and other things. And the way to solve that is TypeScript, is one way of solving that, but it basically adds types to the system, and I'll show you how to do that. It's really simple. It's a really nice addition. It doesn't take too long to integrate, but it makes things much easier. So I'm going to call the app full stack demo, and this will take a little second. So by the way, I've noticed my delay for you guys is about 15 seconds. So just keep in mind that whatever you're seeing is about 15 seconds late, and it'll take me a while to respond to your comments. But at the moment, we're just waiting for the libraries to install. It'll take a little second for the setup to get done, but after that point, we can get into actual development. So to just go over what I'm doing at the moment, just setting up Create React App, and that enables us to do development a lot easier than having to do the build process ourselves. Right, so it's almost done. Cool, so it's done now, just finished up, and we're going to jump into starting this out. So I'm going to open up code, which isn't just the editor I'm using. It doesn't really matter what you use, just have to use something. So code is a really popular one. I like using code. People like using Atom, Visual Studio, also JetBrains, and they have their own suite of tools which you can use, but like WebStorm. But let's open up the main file, and we'll go over what this is. But also, let's start the server in the background. So npm start. And what this will do is open up, you have to go to the directory, open up a window on localhost 3000 here. And this is basically a live development window, right? This will show us what is currently going on our web front end and what exactly we're developing. Right, so we have this front end. I'm going to put this on a little bit on the left. We'll get back to the code, and we'll be coming back to this ever so often to see what our current screen looks like. Cool, but what you'll see is this code here, this edit app.tsx and learn React, that's being shown right here. So if we try to find that code, we'll see right here, edit source.app.tsx and save to reload. Which is really cool. So it has automatic recompilation features. And so what we're actually going to do to get started is just say change that out and say hello world, and then this will reload automatically, and it'll show hello world as our window. Right, so pretty simple. Let's do some styling. So if you guys know any basic CSS, React actually enables us to do inline CSS. It's not exactly preferred, but I'll show you two different ways of doing it. One is inlined like this. So let's change the color of the text to be red. And when it reloads, we'll see here the text is now red. We can also do the usual things with React, like background color. Make that green. It's green now, as you can see. But this is just basic CSS you can do inline. The second way of doing it I'll show you now is using the CSS file that's imported up at the top. Right, so it says import app.css. And so let's actually try to find that. Let's do app.css. It finds that. You can also see it in the source directory here on the right side. Let's open that up. So it has this content, right? Let's not use any of those. Let's just call it something. Actually, let's leave that for now. Let's call this text just text. And let's do the same thing, right? Let's say color red, and then background color green. So one difference you will notice between, yeah, Merry Christmas. One difference you will notice between inline CSS and actual CSS is some of the names. So the names will be a little bit different. As you notice here, we had, for the style, right, we had background color being background, then color in uppercase, and then saying, but this is a little different than the syntax here, which says background dash color. This is actual CSS syntax. This is a slightly modified inline CSS syntax, which React uses so it doesn't have to do dashes in the middle, because that's not proper JavaScript syntax, and so it can't process this accurately. So what it has to do is modify that slightly, and then converts it behind the scenes into being this. So let's actually remove this again, and let's go with. So because we're importing this at the top, right? There's the app.css at the top. What we want to do is now change this name into text in order to show that two different, the background and the color. So let's make it text, let's save it, let's reload the page. And you notice even without the style being red or the color being green, we still have the same properties showing up. And that's because of these text properties we defined here, these CSS properties. Right, so that's basics of CSS that we've shown here. And we're gonna now move into a little more advanced stuff like components and stuff like that. So if you guys are a little lost, I apologize, but this requires some basic knowledge of HTML, CSS, and if you don't know, that's fine, you can still follow along. It just may not all make sense to you at the get-go. Right, so let's actually make a new folder called components. And let's create a new component called like header. And let's make the extension TSX. So just telling you what TSX means. JSX, so JS is JavaScript, TS is TypeScript, JSX is the React form of JavaScript. So that's what these header tags mean. You'll see these tags being called JSX, right? And it's because it's HTML in JavaScript. So we want a TSX file because we want TypeScript inside of React. So what we'll do here is that these files will, oh, did you say VI for life? Oh God, I actually pity you so much. Okay, let's import React, right? Because we need the React library to actually have the entire thing being processed. Oh, the stream is lagging. Oh, it's back, okay. So React is the library we need. So by the way, React is a library, not a framework. And the difference is in Angular, you build your entire web app using Angular. You can't like jump out of it for a little bit and come back to it later on. The entire thing needs to be entirely in Angular. The difference is in React, you can choose when you want to use Angular and when you don't. And so you can have multiple files, and some of them have Angular, some of them use jQuery if you really hate yourself. Some of them have pure JavaScript, some of them have just HTML, CSS, depending on what you want. And you can really modify different files to be in different ways. You get more configurability, even though usually you'll end up using React across the board because it is usually easier to use. But let's create a new header component. Just call it header. I'll be using ES6 syntax, and that's like, not to confuse you, but essentially there's just different ways of writing JavaScript. So more recent JavaScript proposals have more advanced JavaScript, and older ones have just lesser features and so on. Right, so we created a header component. Looks like this, and we actually have to define the type, and we're going to export this, right? But let me tell you, if we leave the props information off, it'll give us a error saying that props is of type any, and this is actually a TypeScript thing. This is not a React thing. If we did pure React, it would not care. But I'm going to turn that off for a second, and then I'll show you what's going on. Right, so if you're really interested, the tsconfig is the TypeScript config file, and this basically tells us what we can compile it, what we can't. So at the moment, we had no implicit any. That means we can't have things being default any as false, as true. So we cannot have a prop of any type, but I changed that to false, and now we can. And so in JavaScript, the default is you can have any kind of prop type you want, or no type at all, because JavaScript is untyped. But what no implicit any means is you have to define either a type for everything or just not have a type. So let me show you what it looks like. Right, so ignore the props for now. We don't really care about it. What we want to do here is just return something really simple, like a div just saying hi in it, right? It'll just say hi. It'll be a horizontal bar. We're going to take out all this content because we don't really want that right now. What we'll then do is import our header from the relative directory. So we're currently in this parent folder of source. We just want to go into components and then go into header and get the header file. And you'll notice for TypeScript files, you don't have to put the extension, or for JavaScript, you don't have to put the extension. It'll automatically look for the .tsx ending. So here we just want to render the header component. Right, so I'll save that, pop over to here, we'll see only the hi. Right, this is the hi from being rendered on this component here, and that's all that's being rendered, there's nothing else. Cool. But we want to add more stuff to that, right? So let me show you how to configure stuff. Let's say we want to change this text into being like hello world. Let's say we have multiple headers. How do we want to do that? That's an issue, because let's say we also have another header here. Right, we have multiple highs, but let's say we want to change the content in them all and have different content in different ones. How do we do that? Well, we can have different ones, and we can have, we need a parameter essentially, is what I'm trying to lead on to. And the point is that by default, there's no way to get parameters in. But in React, the way you do parameters is basically this thing called props. And props are essentially parameters that come in from parent components. So let's define the props we want to see. Let's say we want to render just some text. Right? So we can define a type called props. And then let's say we want to see a type called text. And we define what type it is. So there's a couple different properties in TypeScript. There's string, number, object, null, undefined. There's more as well. There's also custom types that you can build, and then customs. Oh, my bad. Also arrays. But what we want is essentially we want a string, and it's pretty straightforward. So let's assign the type that we want props. We want a props type. What that means is now if we try to, actually let's do this before. If we try to get properties off this prop, it's any type. So Java, the compiler doesn't know, or code doesn't know which possible types it has. So we could say text. And this actually worked fine, right? We could say, what's the prop name? The prop name is text, right? So we assign text here as being one, let's say, hello, right? So what do you guys expect to, oh, think about what you expect to render at the top. We're passing the parameter of hello, and the console logging that here, and let's print it here, sorry. Well, what do you expect here? Well, it should be this hello printed in the top line. So let's see that, yeah, hello is being printed. But nothing's being printed for these two. And that's because we don't have any text being passed in. It's by default undefined. So I'm actually console logging at the moment, which is like the println in Java or cout in C++. And we can look in our log, in our console, and see that we got hello and 2 undefineds. And undefined is like basically the unknown or null for dynamic types. Right, so it makes sense because on the top one we passed in hello, and on the bottom two we passed in nothing, so by default we get undefined. Can you guys tell me if it's making sense till now? Just leave me a quick comment in that chat. Any questions? But yeah, so the issue here is that essentially we know we always want text from the user for that header, but it's not actually being defined. How do we change that? Well, what we can do is actually make this type up here, call props, put in the string as one of the properties we need, and then define this interface here. Right, so when we try props dot, it'll show us text, because by definition require from the user who uses this header component to pass in that text object. That text prop needs to be passed in, or else this won't compile at all. Before, it doesn't really care what we pass in, it'll just work with what we need and what we actually try to call. So if I tried calling something like props.abcd, it's going to stop me because it's in any type. It can have anything on it. It's too broad. That's the issue with dynamic types. I don't really know what's on the property. So if I try props.abcd, I'll get undefined for all of them because they're undefined. I don't really know that. It's dynamically typed. But the cool thing is if I say instead I always want of props type, ABCD is not guaranteed to be on that prop, right? I'm not passing in ABCD in this prop set. So it knows that it can't guarantee that ABCD is a property. And so it'll give me a compile time error like this. If I try to compile it, it'll say, give me a bunch of errors all over the place, saying, well, text is missing, but it'll also show this eventually. Cool. Right, so now up here as well, it's saying text is missing because it says it's required in types prop. So let's change our text to be hello 2, text to be hello 3. Right, so now we get these two different hellos, and that is basically the issue you're trying to solve with props. It's made much easier by TypeScript having a different typing system, which enables us to essentially specify what props we need, what we don't. All right, so another cool thing is we can actually accept CSS properties as well inline. So let's do like styles. All right, let's actually just do color. All right, this color is also a string. And let's do style is, so the same approach as before, background color, and then assign color to that. Or props. Right, so it's going to crash because we didn't give it a color, and it doesn't really know. So let's give it colors. Let's give this one a color of blue. This one a color of red. This one a color of green. Right, so we go over the, is there a way to set a default? Yeah, there's a way to set a default. But the default types props in JavaScript for types are a little funky. The best way to set a default is, I'll actually show you. is probably to just assume a default. You can have something called the default props, right? So, and define one of type props, and then say my text is default text, color is default color. Actually, let's just do white. And then I say something like this. I can leave my text at, if I put a question mark, it means it may or may not be defined. If I put a color here, it may or may not be defined. So what I can say is here, if I can use the ternary operator, I can say if props.color, which means, so if it's undefined, then do this, else use that. So for example, here I want to use my default, so I can do default props.color. And then if not, I can do my actual props.color. Right, so let me actually cut out the color from one of these and the text. And you'll notice it's not giving me a compile time error anymore for this. And the reason for that is now I've defined that these two are optional. Right? The question mark means basically it's optional, and I don't have to define it. Before, when I just had this, it says at compile time, enforce that text is being provided as a prop. But the question mark means that it's optional. You can do it if you want to. It's a customization. So with the default here, now in my third line, I have to change this. Here I'm just doing the exact same thing I did for color. I'm doing for text. And when I do this, I just see default text on my third line with a background color of white. So that's the best way of doing default props here. So in functions, you can do default props in better ways. So essentially, you can do something like this. Function equals color string white. And then I can say color. But see, the issue here is that it's the entire object that has a default. Right? If I do the entire object has a default here, that's not really considering partial objects having a default. It's the entire object. So that's like saying props is provided or not, which isn't really the case. Props is always provided. It just may sometimes be empty, or sometimes text is missing, or sometimes color is missing. That's a different problem than what you're trying to solve. So it doesn't really make sense to say props equals default props. Right? Because props will never be null or undefined. It'll just be, so in this case, I can say fn, right? With no, see, this says has no parameters, but will still because of default properties, default parameters. Right, so it prints out white 3 times, once for each of these components, and the default color here is white. But if I do fn of red, it will print out red by overriding let's say red, white, red, white, red, white. So does that make sense? Is everyone still following? Right, so now let's talk about something that's more advanced in React, state, right? So that's like basically anything that changes. So props to a component is something that does not change. props never change within React. So when you pass a prop down to a component, that prop will always stay the same. So let's talk about something that's really important, excuse me. That's state in a component. So let's create a new component called body.tsx. And in the body, I'm again going to import React from React, and then const body equals, let's just take a props of just nothing for now. And the reason I define the interface, even if I'm taking nothing, is because I may define something in the future. And it's just easy to have that set up right there. Right, so I'm actually going to use a class-based component. We can also do components based on class, right? So this is react.component. And here, props are defined like this. We define render method, and then here we return what we need to. So it's important to note in React, we have two different kinds of components. There's the functional component, which looks like this, and there's the class-based component, which looks like this. Some people prefer class-based components because they're easier to handle in the sense they look like Java classes or C++ classes or something like that. But functional components have the exact same functionality, actually, even a little bit more, depending on what you need to do. But let's see. So for rendering, right, we want to show just some text saying body for now. And let's actually import that back in our app.tsx. Let's import the body, and let's show the body underneath. I'm taking out two of the headers. I'm just going to show the body here. Right, so the body just shows body. Cool. Let's talk about state now. Right, so let's say I have an input here with the name of username. Now let's say it's a login format or login modal. Let's have a label above it that has about equals username. Right, so I then have a body and the place for body. And let's also have something called a button with a type of submit. Right, and let's actually give a little bit of internal content, and let's say log in. You can imagine this is also in a shopping cart or whatever else you'd ever need a button for, which is a lot of things. But we have now a text, we have an input, and we have a login. And what we want to do is basically be able to show a window alert of our current text and login. So the same kind of backend processing would also be used for, let's say, a login on the backend or some kind of server. But really, we just want to catch the event of someone clicking that button and be able to send a external or even internal message, do some kind of event processing on that. Right, so the goal is how do we get the content from this container here, and then when I click login, catch that event and do something with it. So this is where we get into state. So let's define our state object. And so let's think about what state we even need in this situation. The state we need is essentially the content in here, right? That's what's changing. This content is what's changing. So let's have some content for username, which is a string. And let's also have one for password. If you notice, I don't have a password field at the moment, so I'm going to create a new one. And label it password. And I'm going to create a new div so it's on different lines. And so what a div is essentially, it's a horizontal box that stretches as wide as it can. It takes up as much horizontal space as it can. A span takes up only as much space it needs. And you'll notice that's why this div at the top goes all the way wide. And so the point of making this consecutive div is this top div manages all our content. This next div takes up full space width. We then have these two labels inside that. So it's this top and the second div takes up full width, has a label that's not showing at the moment. Yeah, my bad. I was in the middle. Right, so we have username, password, each of these divs go full width, but they go horizontally because they're not divs themselves. And then we have this button, which is on its own div after this div. This button is on the div though. It's in the paired div, not its own horizontal div. But essentially, want to keep track. So what we have to do is actually create these things called handlers, right? So let's do on username, or let's call it handle username, right? This is going to take in a target. I'm going to leave it on type for now. And then we'll do setting username state here. We'll do handle password target. And then do password setting here. And we have an event to catch, which is the button itself. So when we click the button, we want something to show up on the screen. I'm going to do a simple log for now, but we'll move from that point. So handle but login attempt. And so I named this last one E because it's a event, but then I'll do handle login attempt here. Alright, so this is pretty standard in HTML, JavaScript, but it's also standard in any kind of libraries you use. So if you download any libraries and you want to use those, which you will a lot of the time, they also keep pretty standard conventions. So it's the on click for buttons, and I want to assign that to my property, which is this dot handle login attempt. For my input here, I want to assign the change. So on change equals this dot handle password, and then here I say on change equals, well, this one was password, and I have one more for username, so this dot handle username. And again, please feel free to stop me at any point. I'll answer your questions. Right, so let's actually see if we can get something to print when we click this button. So console.log, and then button was clicked. Right, let's click it a couple times, and you'll see pretty cool that we actually get content in our console. So I opened up the console on Windows by pressing F12. On Mac, I think you can go to settings and then there's a console somewhere, my bad. I think Command-Shift-I might work, or Control-Shift-I. But username, password, when we click the login button, we get the login, right? So we're able to now generate a window.alert, and then this was your username. So when we click it, we'll get an alert saying this is your username, but now we need the username itself. We don't have that content just yet. So I'm actually going to do something up here and define a default state, right? So it's going to be public, I just state, and the type is state, or actually, yeah, state. And then I'm going to define a username. It's going to be empty, password is going to be empty. Cool, and the reason this is okay is both strings, and empty strings are totally okay. Oh, yeah, you can't do that. That's more intelligent. You can do right click and then inspect. Go to the console. I think the console might be in the leftmost for the default. Thanks, Moose. But let's try to get the target value right now. So let's actually print the fields we have on it. So this handle username is being called when. It's being called when the change happens on the input. and the input for the username, right? So we expect when we type something into the username field, we should have something, some target, we don't really know what it is yet, being printed out in the console. So let's actually try that, saying this is, so we'll see something already. And let me full screen that. We see this really nasty object with a lot of different things. And I'm going to tell you, you can look up online. Let's do some debugging actually. How to get value of target off of onChange event. And the reason I clicked onChange is because this is called onChange. Right, so this is actually TypeScript as well, which is pretty cool. So it's generally event handlers use e.currentTarget.value. And so that's what we want. We want this value e.currentTarget.value. And what you'll also notice is they give us a type signature for what we're missing. This was also for an input, and we had an input on change, right? So that's exactly what we're looking for. So let's actually use this type as well to type our functions. So this e up here should be called target. You can do refactor with F2 in code. But this should be, as it says, react.form event HTML input element. Right, same thing here. React.form event HTML input element. And then we want off this const username. So const is like final in Java or C++. Actually, no, C++ is const. We can do it should be a string, and that's e.currentTarget, as it says, dot value. Let's actually just log that for now. And here we do console.log. Let's actually define our password, get it off the object. e.currentTarget.value. And then we print the password. Right, we're here again. Let's type in username. Oh, cool. So we're logging the username into our console, so we can see on the right side in our console the username being printed out. And let's do the same thing with password. We get password printed out. Right, so this shows us basically callbacks in JavaScript. And let's now use that to set state. Right, we haven't even talked about state yet. We just talked about events and callbacks. So we have this new value, username and password. We want to store that somehow locally in our class, right? Because when we do this actual event, we have a function here which does our actual event submission. We have a function here which handles our password changes, and a function here which does our username changes. And the inspiration for this is really, how do we get our information that's changing in these into our information, into our function here, and be able to use that information? And it's called state. So what we do with state is actually this really nifty function called this.setState. Right, and it takes a function. But what we'll do here is now with that anonymous function, we can do something like this. Function setState is we have our old property of username, which is this up here, and username. So let me actually show you what that's really doing. Right, so you can do it this way. That's one way of doing it. Yeah, that's that state. Cool. So what this does is basically takes our username property up here, takes in our new username, and basically overrides the old value with the new value. And what this enables us to do is actually keep a local store of both our username and password, so that when we want to actually do the window alert, we can see that information. Let's do the same thing with password. I'm going to do it a little bit differently. So this.set, I'm going to do an arrow function this time. And then I'll do username, password, and then password. So let me actually change this to new password. right? So this changes our password. And let me actually do something that's really important. You'll notice I'm not doing this. I'm not doing this dot state dot username equals new username. And I'll show you why. Notice how many times our object actually gets rendered, right? Each and every time I render the object, I'm going to currently call rendering block again. Right, and then I'll pull this up. And so you'll see two renders at the beginning, and then I'll change the username, and you'll see each and every time there's two renders again. So both for the username and for the password, you'll notice that the render body gets printed again twice. And what that really shows you is that this setState function actually changes our rendering render process. It changes what's being displayed, in the sense that each and every time we change state, we actually re-render the object. And the important thing about that is, let's say I'm actually displaying the current username at the bottom, this.state.username. The current way that this is working, this will actually work just fine. Even though I'm updating, it re-renders by itself, right? Which is really important. Let me show you why this is not acceptable. It's not acceptable to do this at the top. You'll notice, one, our content on the right side does not change, and the render does not happen again. Right, so what this really means is that setState is telling our render function to run again. It's telling our screen that some properties have updated, and in order to be consistent with the data behind the scenes, we have to call again. So this is actually the concept of immutability. Right? In React, all components, when they're rendered, are immutable, meaning they cannot be changed by themselves. So what's really happening is a new component with the same render, but new properties is being generated, and that's what's being shown. And there's optimizations behind the scenes to make it efficient, but essentially it's a new component that's being rendered, right? And that's because you could be setting up props and new data that's being rendered down here as time changes. And if you didn't call setState a render, it's possible that, as in the example up here, we have information that's supposed to be being displayed, but it's not. And that's only possible when we call the render function again. Right, so let's go back to this approach. So to summarize, if you want the component to be rendered, if you want to actually store state, you have to call the this.setState function. Cool. So that's state management. Let me actually show you what this looks like down here. I'm going to use a template string. You attempted to log in with, I'm going to show username from this.state.username and this.state password. One quick thing, the astute of you might have noticed that I did use the actual state variable down here. The reason this is okay is because this is only reading. It's not writing to the object. And reads from this object are always updated. It's just writing to this object is not going to cause a re-render, and that's what's bad. But reading from it is always fine. Right? And I also, wrote from it here. But let's actually try to get that to print out. Let's say username and password. Let's log in. And we attempt to log in with username and password. So that shows basic state management in React. And in reality, it doesn't get too much more complicated than this. If you use libraries like Redux, yeah, things get more complicated, but that's more advanced and not something you have to worry about. Cool. Let's talk about getting external data into our page, right? Let's do something like, let's query the front page of Google, and let's get the HTML content. Right, so there's actually a function in React called fetch, and fetch is actually not supported in Safari, so it may not work for anyone using Safari, which is why I'm going to actually get a library for it in case you want to do so. I'm actually going to kill the front-end install, and I'm going to install a library called Axios. Right, and this is an external library that's on npm. I can link. Oh, by the way, I should ask, any questions till this point? It's a good time to ask. Does everything make sense? State management, any questions you want me to ask? Any uncertainties? Oh yeah, in that string here, I use backticks, and backticks allow us to do template-based strings. So this is a templated string, right? It's templated because it uses variables within the string itself. Single and double quotes will not have the same behavior, by the way. Thanks, Aksham. Right, so we installed Axios. I'm actually also going to get the types for Axios. And the types are basically the definitions of what's available in the library for TypeScript. So that just enables us to do, like, as you noticed before, TypeScript-based objects have much better type recognition in IntelliSense, so we can autocomplete quicker. But it's more productive for development as well, because it's much easier to know what you're actually dealing with on an object which is not familiar to you. So I'm going to start the server back up again. And by server, I don't mean this is still a front end. I just mean the server that's hosting your files and displaying it here. Cool. So it's back up again. And now we'll show how to get some data from external sources in. So we have to import Axios as a library as we would with any other file. You notice it's the same as React in the sense it's not a component, it's an entire library. So you have to use the library-based modular component system instead of our relative imports like this. They're a little different. Same as React though. Right. So let's create a new function. I'm going to do it here in the component did mount. And mounting is essentially when the component is in its initial mounting in the DOM, and the DOM is a document of, wait, did we make the setState function? We'll talk about the DOM in a second. Did we make a setState function? How is that connected to the state type that we defined, or is it overridden? Okay, so essentially the question is that I'm answering is by Caitlin at the bottom. No, we did not make the setState function. So the setState function is a function that's provided by React for any component, and also in any functional component. So this is a class component. There's also one equivalent in functional components called useState. This is something called the React hook, which you should look into. They're really cool and valuable. I actually didn't like them for a while, but I really like them now. But essentially, this state function, this state is a default, right? So this is like the default state that this component starts out with. It fits in the state interface. So you can think of interface as like an interface in Java, in the sense that it has no actual implementation, it's just types. So this has no default values. Right, so the default values are defined here when this object is initially initialized, with a default value of empty string. This setState is a function that ties into the internal state of this object as a whole, of this component as a whole. Right, so the setState here is actually, it's a provided function which React provides. And all we have to do in setState is define a function which takes in an input and returns some update to the current state. Right, so we try something like ABCD and ABCD. This would work totally fine in JavaScript. And the reason is because there's no typing in JavaScript. But in React, and TypeScript, it expects us to have the same type of type, or a subtype, that we have for our class. And because ABCD is not a component of the state, it rejects that. But password is a field on our state. And password's type, which is a string, also matches the type we're trying to assign, which is also a string. Right, so the setState is something that's provided, Caitlin. It's not something we write ourselves. It's part of the internal library that they give us. Is that what your question was? right? So the DOM is basically, I said it below, stands to the document object model. It's like the hierarchy of objects. So for example, that's ours is essentially this div followed by this header. This header is in itself a document of hierarchy, which is this div here followed by this text followed by the closed div, and the bodies itself also a div followed by div label input and so on. So it's a hierarchy. It's basically a tree. It's a DAG if you guys are familiar with graph theory. It's a directed acyclic graph. But essentially, this component mount is called. It's a callback that's called when this component first gets attached to the DOM. So what we're going to do here is use Axios to do axios.get. We're going to do a popular website called google.com, if you guys have heard of that, and then do a log to it. Right, so we expect, by the way, this is using something called a promise. What a promise is it has to do with JavaScript's internal asynchronous system. So JavaScript is built asynchronously, meaning that a lot of its functions are able to run outside the usual synchronous flow. So we're really used to like for loops and while loops being synchronous, right? In the sense that you go through, you wait for everything to process and come back. But oftentimes with really expensive operations, it's good to offload that to something else or wait on it for it just to complete by itself. So what we want to do sometimes is just call a function and let it process behind the scenes and let us know and let it know when it's done. So that way we don't have to wait for it and block for that. So what this is a process, and because all networks can take an indeterminate amount of time, they're faulty, they can take a while to process, it's good to keep network calls as being asynchronous. And so what this does is it basically does a get call to google.com's main server, and a get is essentially what's used for HTTP to get the website. So for example, when I go to google.com on its homepage, this is doing a get request for the HTML and CSS on Google's homepage. It's index.html. Right, so it's pulling all that content and it's showing us that content, and a web browser is actually doing this call and showing that content on the main page. So if you do F12, you'll see similarly, there's a lot of sources here, right? And it's, let me actually show you the ads. Right, so it also has the same things we do. It has a head, it has a body, it has more meta content and stuff like that, but it also has scripts, it has all the JavaScript that we would do, and obviously a lot more. But Google is no different as a site than this is on the front end, right? So what a get request does is it pulls in all the index HTML, but not the CSS or JavaScript that comes along with it that takes additional calls. But when this get resolves and we get the data, we're then saying after that's done, then call this console log on the information we get back. Right? So this will actually respond with a response, and that type is an Axios response. And then I actually don't know the type of, probably a string or something. So if you do control space, you can get a type, but we're going to import the type ourselves. So the type is Axios response. So you'll notice I did this dereferencing here. And what this means is I want to get the subtype from Axios called Axios response. There's a second way of doing that, which is Axios.Axios response, and that's the same thing. Well, actually, I guess not. But Axios response, and we're going to go and make an arrow function and say get that data, get the response, and we have a field called data, which stores the data from the response, and then we just get the data back and print it. Format. Save this. Cool. So when we get the mount, we should expect something to print the console after that. Let me open up the console. Let me hard reload. Look in the console. Oh, that's annoying. Oops. It's a CORS policy. It's blocking us because we're a different. Basically, Google is blocking us from getting their content. Let me actually try my website. I don't know if I have a CORS policy. Oops, I do. So funny enough, what we did was actually, because the issue was a CORS, which is a cross-origin response CORS, cross-origin resource sharing. So that's basically doing API calls from different web browsers. I just actually call our own endpoint. So this actually gets the HTML for the website we're displaying, funny enough. And you'll see here is we just got a bunch of this content, which is actually our HTML page being printed to our HTML page. So this you'll see here is this div here is actually where our React app is being stored. So I can show you in the index.html. You see this root here? This is the same thing as what's being displayed here. And in our index.tsx, we're actually rendering our entire application to that root element. So really, this is the parent of all our content on our page. Cool. But yeah, this is how you do external calls. This is how you'd also do an external call to like a server. Right, so do you guys want to see me do a quick setup for a server, and I can show you how that would look? Doing an API call to a backend. Or if you guys have anything else you want to learn in React, past the basics of what we just did, I'd be happy to focus on that as well. Up to you. I guess I'll just do the backend then. Cool. Yeah, I'll do the backend. Oh, sure. Yeah, backend. Wait, Shawnee, didn't you just see the backend like 2 days ago for my Surge demo? Fine, I'll do the backend again. Cool. So I'll open up a second console and go to that same directory. And then also do a npm I, and then I need some libraries. So Express, I'll do the types for that. Library called cores. Yeah. Right, so I just got this error because I was running the server at the same time as this is trying to install, and it doesn't like that. So I had to kill the React app. Yeah, sure, I could do both if you guys want to stick around. I just don't know how much time you have. I'd be happy to do both. Right, so I'm gonna set up a new folder here, and actually a new file called index.ts, and I'm gonna do some imports. So import Express, and it's gonna be our server framework. And what Express is basically, well, I just said it's a server framework for Node.js and JavaScript, well, Node.js specifically, which enables us to do API calls, API requests, handle API calls from front ends, different resources, and so on. Come on, Nisha. But yeah, so Express enables us to serve assets to other people calling our backend. So I'm going to create a new instance. So Express is the framework itself. We have to create an instance of Express, and that's like the server. Then we have to do app listen. And what listen does is sets up an app listening on a certain port. It basically binds to it, meaning it's going to be listening to that certain port for TCP, HTTP traffic. Let's put it on 8,000. And then as soon as it gets set up, because it's asynchronous, we're going to say server is running. Right, so I'm going to actually install this little tool called... There's a tool called TS Node Dev. You can install it by... Actually, sorry, let me make a new server folder called server. And then I'll go into server and do tsc init. And this initializes a TypeScript folder without doing... yeah, I can share this. And this is a TypeScript folder without doing... this is what create React app does behind the scenes when I use -- template TypeScript. But doing it manually, you can get a tool called TSC by doing npm ig, which is npm install global, and then TypeScript TSC. So TSC is the compile tool, TypeScript is the edition itself. TSC init initializes a new TypeScript folder, essentially. I can move the index.ts from our parent folder into this current one. And so I'm going to actually do ts node dev here. Cool. You'll see server is up and running. And the way we can see this is essentially by pulling up our web window again, but instead of port 3000, we can go to the port that it's running on, which is port 8000. And you'll see cannot get, but this is actually a good thing, even though it looks like an error message. It's a good thing because cannot get means we're getting a response from something. And usually when there's no port set up, we'll just get a message like this that says cannot resolve, depends on the browser you're using. But it says I can't be reached. And this means the server is down. But if you get this, that means the server is up. It's just not serving any content on that. So let's do this. Because we know HTTP requests are gets, and we want something to show our main page, let's do // Slash is that main, so slash is the route that you get when there's nothing there. There's, like, by default, a phantom slash sign, right? And so if we leave that off, you get what this is here, but if you put it on, it's the same URL that's resolving. So this actually takes in two parameter request, which is of type request express.request, and a response, which is of type express.response, right? And what we do here is essentially, let's just do a response.send, and this is sending content, right? Well, let's actually send JSON. Send content. I would say hello client, and we just save that. And TS Node Dev has an automatic behind the scenes recompilation. So you'll see my server should be up and running again. Right, but I can load this now. I'll say hello client, which is awesome. And you can actually do some fun stuff with this. You can do inline JavaScript here, or inline HTML. If you do template on the outside, you can put anything you want on the inside. So style, color, and just do red. So yeah, you can do inline client apps from the backend. And there's actually a word for this called server-side rendering, which is pretty big. It's actually really good for SEO, which is search engine optimization. It's a little different than client-side apps. So web crawlers are not as good at going through client-side applications, which is like React and Angular. So some sites actually move to server-side rendering to do some of their processing, because it's more efficient in terms of SEO and like ACM, which is search engine marketing. But besides the point, you can see we can clearly send content from the back end to the front end. And let's actually have an API route set up. We can do api.get slash, I don't know, let's do slash API. I'm really original. Express.request response. So it's the same setup for each every time for any kind of route you want to build. And let's do response status. So 200 is successful. And then we can do JSON, put in a body, say the response. So by the way, this response here is part of the JSON. It's not part of the response object up here in scope. This is part of the JSON I'm sending. So it's like it's JSON. Its response is a string literal. It's the same as doing this. Just don't want to confuse you. Response is thanks for calling the API. Right. So if we pull up slash API, you'll get JSON. Thanks for calling the API. And by the way, I have a JSON formatter for my Chrome extensions so that my JSON comes out formatted for debugging. But you guys will see the same thing, just unformatted. But let's say we can call this endpoint from our client on the front end. Right, so essentially, let's go back to our body. And you can see here, we get this get, and then we show the response. So what's a response type? A response type is not type string. A response type is now the JSON type. So it's response of some body, which is a string. Let's see here, we have this response and some body, which is a string. So let's just emulate that type here, response and some body, which is a string. And then let's change our get request to hit that port of 8000. Right, so let's actually reload the page here. Hard to reload. We actually get a block by cores, which is the same issue we had before. So let's fix that. And you'll notice before when I did the download with npm, I actually installed this library called cores as well, which is the issue we've been facing, right? It's been blocked by cores. So what this actually allows us to do is set up our server such that it doesn't really care where the response came from. This is not good for usual applications. It's only good for like development. What do we do? From first, and then we say app dot. So Express supports a lot of really cool things called middlewares. And middlewares are basically preprocessors that pre-process requests, and they can morph and change requests and responses before they hit your actual route. So by actual route, I mean something like this. And you can actually set up your own middlewares to run with. But these are common ones that are used and are handy to use in general, that are already on NPM that you can use. As I used so many times. So they're actually missing the types for cores, which is being a pain in the ass, but I'll just get the types for that and then save it. So it's npm install -- save and just types at /core. Am I back? Cool. Yeah, sorry about that. My network glitched out. I think I'm using a pretty high-res monitor, and so I couldn't handle the amount of data being processed. Okay, what we're going to do is use this library by saying app.use. So you can build your own middlewares, and you can also download middlewares, but this is a pretty simple one you can download and use. 1 second. Yeah, so sorry about that. So what we're going to do is go to the front end and again enable that call to happen again. Right, so we're going to refresh this. I will see this content here saying /style/red hello client. So this is actually a landing page content. So we want to change this to now map to our API page content. So do /API and reload this. And now we'll see in our content response, thanks for calling the API. So we actually were able to call the backend and get content. And so what we can also do here is based on this content, we can have another feature called server response. And we can do dynamic content rendering. So we have to update our types and our state to show this server response field existing as a string. Right, so it's an empty, but let's render that below the login and say this dot state dot server response. And when we get the callback, we can actually do dot set state and say server response of that new data. Response.data.response. Right, so what that means for the front end is God damn it, it's too fast is the issue. So let me actually slow down how this would look. We response back. Let's not set the state immediately. Let's do a timeout. Right, so a timeout is basically, it's a delay to the future. That'll resolve sometime again in the future. So let's put a 2000 second out, a 2000 millisecond out. So that means essentially do not process this for 2000 milliseconds. Close off the parenthesis. Oops, wrong order. So 2000 and then content. That's right, just wrong place. Okay. Cool. So what this means is we'll get the response back from the server, which is instantaneous almost, but then it'll take 2000 milliseconds to 2 seconds to actually show, or at least 2000 milliseconds to show on the screen. And the cool thing is now we can see that initially nothing gets rendered, but then it'll say, thanks for calling the API. Just change that saying default server response. And so it'll default show that. And then it'll show, thanks for calling the API. So that's really cool. That's a conditional rendering. So you can do something like a loading screen or show something like that's still loading. So you can say something like loading, right? And then when it loads, show the API information. And obviously you can make this more advanced by having cool looking features and stuff of the kind like and CSS formatting. right? So that was a lot cooler. So things like that with styling. And you can make components based on basically buffering and waiting for things to load and so on. So does that give you an idea of how to do API calls and so on? Oh, and let me actually show you something. You can pass information from the front end to the back end as well. So let's actually do this call after we get the click from the login attempt. Right here, let's actually send as data in our params. Let's send in as our username the current username state and the password, the current username password, and the current state password. Right, so in this case, sending back information from the front end to the back end. So now we have two-way communication. So let's look in the back. And in this API, let's actually skim off those parameters from the params field. So this will be const username of type string equals request, and there's a query field here. So it's a little confusing. There's a params here and there's a query. The params is a little different. We're going to go with the query. And we're going for the username field and then the password field. Let's just log those for now. Okay, cool. So let's actually, that's interesting. JSON.stringify. Well, let's just do at string. Let's see if that works the way I want it to. I actually don't know. And let's load the console here and this as well. Right, so username, password, login. Cool. So actually the backend got it. So I got the backend content of username and password, which is exactly what we wanted. So now we have two-way communication. Right, so what we can actually do is now cycle that back around and say, thanks for calling the API with username and password. And then on the back front end, we can say, basically, put in the username and the password, press login, and then after it gets back, we can say, thanks for calling username, calling the API with this information. And we can keep calling it and it'll keep changing. But this really shows the cyclical flow of modern development, right? In the sense that it's not only front and back end, you have two-way communication basically all the time between those two in order to get just reactive response, reactive content on the screen, along with getting content to a database. Like for example, I can use my backend right now to store to a database or something like that. I actually have a demo on that if you guys want to see that. But essentially, it just shows that not everything is one way anymore, as it was like in the 90s, and you can have a lot of really back and forth communication in the sense. And so in reality, what you would probably do here, after getting this content from the URL, is query a database, see if a username and password with this combination match. And if they do, then respond with like a JWT, which is a JSON web token, or send a cookie back to the front end, or send some kind of information saying you've been authenticated, you can log in. And then every time the front end wants to do a request to the backend that's protected in some way that requires login, you also send the JWT along it, or the cookie. And if that, you basically write a middleware saying check for that cookie, check for that JWT, and if it exists, then let them log in. else just send 400 or 401 or 403, which means unauthorized or unauthenticated, which means that you can't log in until you send a JWT. So yeah, that's what an API backend looks like. So it's a really simple backend, which you would use. But yeah, any questions? Did that make sense? I know it's a lot of information. I've been talking for a while. Oh, site cannot be reached. Did you try the app.listen at the bottom section? So actually, I can show one more thing, which is compiling the front end, serving it from the back end. And essentially, the thing is that in the production level application, your front end and back end will be on the same port, right? The front end talks to the back end, it's on the exact same port system. Right, so the issue is at the moment we have our backend running on 8,000 and our front end running on 3,000. And the issue with that is essentially that doesn't replicate how a full front end website look. And essentially, this is not really representative of how a production environment would be. This is a development environment only. So what you have to do is actually a couple things. One, I'm actually going to replace this /8000 with a /API. And there's a way of getting around this. I can... Right, so there's a way of getting around this that doesn't have to deal with funky requests using a proxy, and the proxy sets up only in development. I can show you what that's like. I actually set it up for you guys if you're interested. But it looks a little like this. We install another module called... One sec, let me actually pull up an existing version of how it looks. Right, so it looks like this. Essentially, it's a configuration file called setupproxy.js. What it does is it routes all API calls that start with /API. I think with the core stuff. So if it's asking for if it's saying the website isn't available, that's an Express issue. Right, so what this does is basically takes all API requests at /API and it routes it to 8,000, which means that it's only also applies in development environments, which means in dev, what you can do is you can write all your code as being absolute and relative paths to your home directory. So something like /API. And in dev mode, this will actually redirect to localhost /8000, localhost 8000. But in prod, it would be on the same port as you're currently on. It's the same server, which is exactly what you want. Right, so to get that set up, we have to install this package here. npm I save this. And run the server again. But what this lets us do is basically, you'll see here, when we build this, this will also work. So at the moment, we didn't put the 8,000, but this is still a route to 8,000, which is really good. In prod, it'll stay on the same port, it won't change, meaning it'll also go to our backend when we build it in. So let's check if that is up and running. Oops, let's see, what happened? Proxy is not a function. Oh yeah, I was dealing with this today. Something changed in the API. It's create proxy middleware. And you can Google that, by the way. That's just something I Googled recently, so I know about it, but that's Googleable. Right, so the really cool thing is let's send in the username and password again. And remember, this is with the relative path. It says you attempted to log in with that. It'll then say loading, and in a couple seconds it'll show us that same response as before. But the magic is that in this body here, we didn't specify which port to go to. It didn't say localhost 8000. It just said /API. And because we wrapped this API and we configured this proxy to use 8000 go to API, it sends a request automatically. So let's actually get express to server, content name server, right? So npm run build compiles the React app. Right, so it built, and which means that we have the compiled HTML and CSS built into our code, built into this production folder called build. All right, that's what this is in. So then we're going to use something called express.static, which is a way of serving static files. So we can say express.static, and then, so we go back one directory, we then say go into client, or go into, so we're currently in this folder called server. We have to go on to get into this main directory, then we have to go into build, and that's actually it. Right, so we rebuild that, and then we actually pull up port 8000 instead of 3000. And the really cool thing is now a website is compiled and it displays. So this is our actual full website displayed with a React and backend on the same server. Get username, password, log in, and the functionality is the exact same, and it'll show right here. But now all our code, we don't even need 3000 anymore. 3000 is done. We have all our code running on this one exact server port 8000, which I think is pretty cool. That's like what the build would look like. And in reality, for production, you'd use something like Nginx, which is a static site host. I would not recommend serving with Express and production level applications. You can also do caching using Nginx and compression and gzip and all kinds of cool stuff that improves your website performance. But it's not really doable using Express or as easily. But this is a good way to just prove your website works, show some basic demos, and get it to work. But yeah, now it's on the same port. Any questions? I mean, I'm essentially out of content, and I can do other things like AWS deployment or something if you guys have like 20 minutes you want to spend, but I feel like it's been long enough, and I don't know if anyone's actually still paying attention. Cool. Any questions? if you guys have 20 minutes, we can do an AWS or cloud deployment. If that's really something of interest, but if it's only one person who wants it, I can get it done like personally instead of here. So just if you have interest in AWS deployment, just leave a vote in the chat, and it'll take about 20 minutes realistically.
Yes? No?
No.
Oh, okay. Say I'm an accurate no. That's not. You're still you said no. So you look at this, I'm like true, and he's like no. So that's why I said so.
I guess I don't see any votes for cloud deployment except Saksham, so I guess that's all. If you guys are interested in that, that's fine. Yep, that's about all, I guess. Cool. Thanks for coming out, and I'll get this stuff posted in general, both the video and the link for the GitHub. Cool. See you guys.